Ann Arbor Energy Commission to order at 4 minutes after 6. Will you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Schreiber.
Here.
Commissioner Colvin Garcia. Commissioner McCumber. Chair Appleyard.
Here.
Commissioner Mirsky.
Here.
Commissioner Paleg.
Here.
Commissioner Lenski.
Here.
Councilmember Eaton.
Here. Great. Approval of the agenda. I hear a motion.
So moved.
Second?
Sir, second.
Any changes in order to the agenda? If not, I'll call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Moving on, approval of last meeting minutes. Anybody have any changes to the minutes? Not, I'll call for a motion to approve.
I move to approve the minutes as submitted.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, moving right along. Now is one of two times during the meeting that the public can come up to the microphone and tell us who they are and give us a tirade about energy in America.
A 3-minute tirade, right?
3 minutes, limited to 3 minutes.
Hello, I'm Nancy Schiffler. I'm chair of the local Huron Valley group of the Sierra Club. And I sent in the written copies of my comments. I think those got distributed. So I just want to make a couple points on them. This is regarding the petition or the resolution about the DTE proposed natural gas plant. And what I wanted to provide a little information about the testimony that the Sierra Club, MEC, and NRDC presented to the Michigan Public Service Commission regarding this proposal. They had testimony that was based on a critical review of the modeling process that DTE was using to make its case for the approval of the certificate of necessity for the plant. And essentially, the review indicated that, in fact, their modeling that they produced was fatally flawed. The DTE manually selected and compared sort of the non-optimal resource plans. They improperly modeled the energy efficiency component and penalized renewables resources in calculating this. So essentially, the testimony showed that, in fact, there are available cost-effective alternatives to the plant, and simply by including additional renewable energy efficiency programs, load management, and demand response, they could meet the needs with what we currently have. And I just wanted to sort of emphasize those points. We certainly are in support of the resolution that you're working on tonight. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else from the audience?
Hi, my name is Morgan Berry, and I'm a resident of the north side of town. I also represent a local group called City by City, which is just forming here in Ann Arbor, which pushes cities toward carbon neutrality. So obviously, I'm also in full support of the resolution you're planning on working on tonight. For me and for the other members of City by City, this natural gas plant is in direct opposition to Ann Arbor's plans toward using renewables as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak?
Hi, my name's Ember McCoy. I'm an Ann Arbor resident. I'm also a recent master's graduate and current staff member at the School for Environment and Sustainability. I'm also an organizer for the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I also want to just thank you for bringing the DTE resolution to the committee today. It's no secret that Ann Arbor is passionate about meeting our energy needs with clean energy, and that we set that ambitious goal to meet 100% renewable energy by 2035. And like Morgan said, I believe that this proposed natural gas plant is one of the biggest threats to meeting this goal and to also securing clean energy here in our city while also doing so elsewhere across the state. All of you heard at last month's meeting about how DTE has not upheld its responsibility to fairly evaluate clean energy options in their proposal for this plant, and that they made careless analytical errors, inconsistencies, and inaccurate assumptions when completing their analysis for the Michigan Public Service Commission, and also that the Union of Concerned Scientists expert analyses shows that a mix of clean energy options can meet customers' power needs by $340 million less than the cost to build and run this plant. And also that alternate options could create 10 times more construction jobs and 4 times more permanent jobs than the proposed natural gas plant. Since that last Ann Arbor Energy Commission meeting, the city of Ann Arbor itself also filed a reply brief in the proceedings, and for different reasons also state that that DTE has failed to adequately justify its need for the gas plant. We also recently found out since that meeting that the Michigan Public Service Commission staff since itself agrees. In their initial brief, the staff noted that DTE's high gas projection costs were lower than the industry highs, that demand response, energy waste reduction, and renewable energy numbers in DTE's analysis all seemed off, and that they could reasonably deny the request and tell DTE to redo the analysis, and that some of this could have made the natural gas plant seem like the cleanest energy option. But they also said that they didn't have time to evaluate the alternative analyses and that they're also still considering recommending the plant. So as a passionate environmental and climate justice activist myself, I care deeply about the effects of this plant and how it may affect our climate and in turn public health. But I also care deeply about how it will affect intersecting economic issues such as jobs, energy affordability here in Ann Arbor and elsewhere, and also about the alarming ways that DTE seems to have been self-interested in this proposal. So again, thank you for bringing it to the floor today. I encourage you to move forward with it, to take advantage of the opportunity to tell DTE and the Michigan Public Service Commission that Ann Arbor and its residents are ready to take ambitious steps towards a fossil-free future, and that we do not want expensive and dirty gas from fossil fuels. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Jenny Rogers. I am a resident of Ann Arbor, and I'm also involved with the local chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. I also want to thank you for talking about this proposal against the DTE gas plant and encourage you to support the resolution. I have 3 main concerns with the proposed plant. First, it doesn't sound like it is in the best interest of ratepayers. According to some of the analyses that other people have talked about, it would save several $100 million if DTE invested in renewable energy and energy efficiency programs. So it would be cheaper for them to not build the plant for customers. Second, I'm concerned about potential conflicts of interest with DTE's financial interest in natural gas and the Nexus pipeline. And finally, and what I'm most passionate about is that it locks us into decades more of fossil fuel infrastructure and burning of fossil fuels. And we all know that scientists say that we need to quickly transition away from fossil fuels or we'll face catastrophic effects of climate change. There was even a new article out today by Bill McKibben saying how natural gas has has been advertised as being a great bridge fuel, and it is not as, or there's a lot more potential for risk than what's been talked about, because there's so much methane leakage in getting it to the plants, and methane is such a more potent greenhouse gas. So I encourage you to vote against it, and thank you for taking this up. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak?
Hi, my name is Matt Haugen. I'm an Ann Arbor resident, and I'm co-chair of the Huron Valley Democratic Socialists of America. Others have done a great job of highlighting some of the specific issues with this particular plant that are unique to this plant. So I want to just touch on a few more broad general issues with this plant. First, two recent groundbreaking studies. The first one, which just came out today, showing that fracking cannot be a practice in a manner that does not threaten human health. One of the 8 authors, a biologist, Sandra Steingraber, said fracking is the worst thing I've ever seen. You can't frack without poisoning the air, contaminating the water, and imperiling the health of Americans. The other study is from 2 months ago from NASA, examining the massive increases in methane we've seen in the last few years, which for those who don't know is 86 times more potent than CO2 at trapping heat. They found that they found evidence that this is coming directly from the fracking shale boom, making natural gas potentially even worse for the climate than coal. We stand at perhaps the most important time in human history. Right now we're living in a very small window of time left to act to reverse the ecological destruction our system relying on fossil fuels is causing in order to save the planet and human civilization. The fact that building a massive new natural gas plant is even being considered in 2018 is ludicrous. This project cannot be approved. Let's send a message that Ann Arbor stands on the right side of history and understands the gravity of the threat we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak?
Hi there. My name is Jay Zocker, a community member here in Ann Arbor. I've heard a lot about other effects of natural gas. Wanted to give another thing that's a little bit less publicized, but just pure water use of hydraulic fracturing. In 2010, Congress directed EPA to study the water use in fracking. Their 2011 report indicated they estimated that 70 to 140 billion gallons of water are used each year to frack 35,000 wells in the U.S., approximately 2 to 10 million gallons per single well. That's equivalent to the water use of 40 to 80 cities of the population of 50,000. And also, hydraulic fracturing is exempt from the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, so they do not need to disclose all of the chemicals or other things that are in that water. And therefore, it is not necessarily considered toxic or hazardous since they are exempt. So some of that water that they use every year, it stays behind inside the well. Some of it comes back up. They can recycle some of it to reuse again. Some of it ends up being injected into disposal wells, never to be seen again. And some of it, since it's not considered hazardous, is actually even sold to use on roads as de-icer or suppressed dust. So if these drillers were to lose their federal exemption that allows their toxic waste to not be considered toxic, or if they would be required to actually return that water to a state useful for human consumption, then that external cost of the water that they're using for free would essentially become part of the actual cost of the natural gas electricity rates that we would all be paying. So I see this as an unsustainable practice with cities and countries around the world that do not have enough water, that we are using water, life-giving water, to throw down into the ground to extract fossil fuels. So I think within the number of years that it's going to take people to realize that this unsustainable process is destroying life-giving water to extract fossil fuels, I think that's going to be less than the amount of time it's going to take to amortize this billion-dollar plant, and it's going to leave us all with paying the stranded asset costs. So I highly also support taking this resolution forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak?
Good evening. My name is Becky Stanfield. I'm not a resident of Ann Arbor, but I wanted to be here tonight because my organization, which is called Vote Solar, has been very involved in the proceeding before the Public Service Commission. So for those of you who don't know us, Vote Solar is a national nonprofit solar advocacy organization. And I wanted to express my appreciation first for the city's commitment to clean energy and to progress on climate change. And just reiterate what you've already heard. DTE's proposal, 20 years ago when I was starting my career would have been considered progress moving from coal to gas. But 20 years later, the cost of renewables have plummeted and the effectiveness of renewables has made it capable of filling that gap. So we don't need a bridge technology from coal to renewables. Renewables are ready today. I also just wanted to reiterate that less than 2 years ago, the state passed new resource planning rules through the legislature. And it was designed to prevent exactly this situation where a large resource choice by a utility was being made without fully considering all the alternatives. DTE did not complete that analysis. DTE filed its plan under the old rules. And the consequence is that they have not adequately considered the cost savings or the economic development benefits of going with a more flexible, diverse portfolio of resources. The three thoughts that I just leave you with are we can save people hundreds of millions of dollars on their electric bills by going with a more flexible portfolio of resources. We can create more jobs, as someone else has already mentioned. There was an analysis presented to the commission that showed that a renewable energy plan would create 10 times more construction jobs and 4 times more permanent jobs. And of course, we reduce pollution at the extraction site, along the pipeline, and at the smokestack. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address those questions. But otherwise, I just want to support the resolution and thank you for your work.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to speak? Seeing none, I will call the public meeting, the public inputs portion to a close and move on to the energy report.
So, on the topic of climate and carbon, there are a couple seminar series coming up at our esteemed university, so just making folks aware initially of those as well as a couple other events. Thursday, March 22nd at 3:30 in the Kalamazoo room at the Michigan League. The topic is this carbon neutral, of this carbon neutral panel is, can land management contribute to a net carbon sink, and can it be monitored accurately? With an emphasis on forestry practices. On the 29th of March is an additional carbon neutral seminar series for opportunities advancing CO2 removal technology and policy, so maybe less the natural environment and more how technology can contribute. So negative emissions in a sense, so that will be on March 29th, also at 3:30. Also at the Michigan League in the Henderson room. I'll send out additional details if folks are interested. As to our own events, a little bit further out into April, do want to put a plug in for the final 4 of 4 sustainability forum. This one will be on water. So if you want to know where it comes from, where it goes in Ann Arbor, how it all works, it's a good example of a sustainable system that we have here. So Water 101 on April 19th. From 7 to 8:30 p.m. at the Downtown District Library will be the last forum. We had a good event here in March on civic engagement. I know a couple folks here in the room are present, so hope you can make it out to our final forum for the year. And then a plug also for Sunday, April 22nd is the 47th Annual Earth Day Festival at Leslie Science Center. So we'll be out there and always happy to entertain commissioners who wish to join and rub elbows with the common folk and hear from the children mostly. It's a good event for kids and families especially, so we get schooled on what's what's really going on, and it's a lot of fun. So that's from noon to 4, again on the 22nd for Earth Day. So, pass it along from there.
Great. Any other energy news from anyone? I don't think I have anything.
Maybe there's something that I can mention, and that is, just for general information, there is an initiative at the University of Michigan to get the university to commit to a net zero carbon target. There is a petition that's currently being circulated primarily around through to students, but it's intended that it will go more broadly, asking President Schlissel and the regents to make a net zero pledge. There's some benchmarking studies that have been done that compare the university's current targets as well as its performance to date against other Big Ten universities and peer institutions. That shows the U of M fares very poorly against those other institutions. There's going to be a workshop on the 5th of April. It's by invitation only, but there's going to be, I think, well over 100 people that are going to be there. There's going to be people from, obviously, the university, both faculty and students and staff, also some alumni, as well as some representatives from other universities talking about what they have done at their locations. So I just wanted to make everybody aware of this going on, and also to at least consider signing the petition. It should be going out via various groups and social media and things like that here in the coming days. It's already been sent to students, and the intention is to try to get it out more broadly before the workshop on the 5th.
Great, thank you. Any other energy news that you'd like to share? If not, we'll move on to the next order of business, which is the DTE natural gas plant resolution. Should we read this thing? I suppose we should.
Yes.
Resolution concerning DTE's proposed 1,100 megawatt natural gas power plant. Case study U 18419 at the MPSC. Whereas DTE Energy submitted a certificate of necessity, CON, application to the Michigan Public Service Commission, declaring a need to build an 1,100 megawatt natural gas-fired power plant that will cost almost $1 billion, a cost to be passed on to consumers. Whereas in December 2012, with the passage by the Ann Arbor City Council of the Climate Action Plan, the City of Ann Arbor committed to an ambitious multi-strategy vision to address climate change by reducing its community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 8% by 2015, 25% by 2025, and 90% by 2050 relative to year 2000 baseline carbon dioxide equivalent emission levels. Whereas numerous independent experts from groups as diverse as the MEC and ABATE have found DTE's modeling failed to include options and scenarios that would lead to cheaper electrical generation than the proposed plant. Whereas DTE has received at least 141 applications from renewable energy producers to build clean energy projects in Michigan that would substantially reduce the need for a new power plant. Whereas building this plant will make it more difficult for Ann Arbor to meet its CAP goals. Whereas multiple experts have presented analysis showing that a continued ramp of renewable energy at current rates, along with an increased rate of energy waste reduction and additional demand-side management programs, could provide an equivalent amount of reliable electricity at lower cost than the proposed in DTE's certificate of necessity application, with less risk due to fluctuations in future natural gas prices and lower GHG emissions. Whereas additional research shows that a diverse mix of clean energy sources would result in 5,000 construction jobs and 134 permanent jobs across Michigan, far more than the 35 permanent jobs and 500 construction jobs expected to result from the gas plant in DTE's proposal. Whereas granting of this CON will allow DTE Energy to recover costs for this plant during construction. Whereas the MPSC staff found the following issues and inconsistencies in DTE's submission. 1, concerns with the competitive bid process. 2, concerns with the way in which demand-side resources were modeled. 3, concerns with the modeling of alternative resources and the ability of the model to equitably choose alternatives due to potential limitations. 4, concerns with DTE's risk analysis. 5, DTE's refusal to model a resource scenario which staff requested. 6, DTE's forecasts for natural gas prices were too low. 7, numerous concerns with DTE's IRP resource screening. 8, DTE's scenarios and sensitivities were not robust enough. 9, DTE did not adequately consider energy efficiency in its IRP. 10, DTE did not fully consider demand response and energy efficiency as a solution to displace some capacity requirements. And 11, DTE should have considered a case with higher levels of renewables, demand response, and energy efficiency, which combined could delay or displace the need for a new natural gas combined cycle generating facility. Resolved that the Energy Commission recommends that the Public Service Commission deny DTE's certificate of necessity, case U18419, and require DTE to draft an IRP that includes more renewable energy, energy conservation, and demand-side management. That's the motion I've proposed on the floor. Do I have a second?
Second to consider the motion as written.
Discussion on the amendment, on the resolution.
I just wanted to point out a small detail that might ensure more clarity to include what IRP stands for, the Integrated Resource Plan. It's just the acronym.
That's a good point. You recommending that as an amendment?
I recommend that we amend the resolution and include the full term.
I, as the chairman, can add that, so I will add that.
And also at point 5, where it says a DTE's refusal to model a resource scenario which staff requested. That's
MPSC staff?
okay. It was at Ann Arbor's staff, MPSC staff.
MPSC. It refers to the beginning of that whereas, where it says MPSC staff.
Yeah.
But we can put that.
Just
Any other requests for alterations or comments?
I have a question. I don't know if someone in the room knows what the depreciation schedule is for a new plant. Is it written off over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years? Does anybody know? Do you know, by chance?
No, not for this one.
I don't know either.
And the reason why I ask is, I assume it's for something in the range of 30 years. I know that the company that I formerly worked for, buildings were written off over 35 years, and my guess is that this would be an asset that also is written off over that period of time. So if something were to change substantially, as was mentioned earlier, this would have the potential of being a stranded asset, and that means that ratepayers would potentially then have to pick up any depreciation that hasn't already been written off in rates. So this is a decision that is not something that can be undone if factors change in 10 years or in 15 years, this will be a decision that will have implications for whatever the depreciation schedule is for an asset like that.
It's a good point. I don't know what that number is.
It has to do with the life of
the
the
asset.
facility, right,
Yeah.
which varies depending on the type of the asset.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a nuclear facility, I'm sure, is longer than a natural gas plant, but I assume a natural gas plant also has a substantial life.
So, some of the coal plants have been running for 60 years,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
they've probably been
They've been
fully depreciated
for a
before
while,
that.
which
Yes.
is why they're so cheap.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I don't know what, I would be surprised if it was less than 30 years.
Well, I'll jump in, I guess, and share
Sure.
my perspective, both on the resolution and on the certificate of necessity filing more generally. So I'm not going to try and address every single point in the resolution or that others have raised. This is obviously a tremendously complex subject, and there are many, many hundreds of pages of documents and testimony and modeling results and so forth. And I certainly encourage anybody who really wants to understand it deeply to go read some of those and dig into some of the details. But there are a couple pieces I'll address. And first, I heard some feedback from some of the audience members, and there's a long whereas clause in here that describes the questions that the MPSC staff raised about DTE's filing. And I want to be very clear for anybody who's not familiar with the process of an MPSC contested case, that the raising of these kinds of questions and concerns is exactly the MPSC staff's job. It is not, I just don't want anybody to leave thinking that the fact that those questions are asked somehow indicates that DTE was filing in bad faith, or even, frankly, that DTE erred in what it submitted. We should all be very thankful as consumers of energy and other regulated utility products that the MPSC staff is doing their job, which is for any filing to prod and poke and try and poke holes in it, right, and to try and dig in and really, pressure test all the assumptions and all the data and the analysis, and that is what they do. And then, ultimately try and use their best judgment, having gone through that process, to decide whether, in fact, the proposal is in the best interest. It's the most prudent and reasonable for customers. And then in a contested case proceeding, interveners can challenge, right? They can challenge the filing, they can propose alternatives for the MPSC to consider. And I believe that, some of the fellow commissioners and some of the organizations here have been formal interveners in this case. And ultimately, to get approval, DT would need to convince the MPSC staff, despite all their poking and prodding and trying to understand the numbers, that in fact, this is the most reasonable and prudent solution for customers. So just a process kind of thing there I wanted to cover. The second thing that I'd like to share is a little bit about DTE's own process to get to this decision and some of the reasoning behind the decision that DT made to file this certificate of necessity for the gas plant. So DT modeled 52 scenarios using a wide range of assumptions about a lot of variables, because there's a lot of unknowns as you're looking at, as you've said, a long-lived asset, right, and a lot of things that you don't know how they're going to change. So DT modeled these 52 scenarios and then considers the outcome or the impact of these scenarios along multiple dimensions. And in energy planning, there's a set of best practices of dimensions that need to get considered, and those are things like the reliability, the affordability, the level of clean energy and sort of emissions generally, the flexibility that the plan allows, the diversity, so having a balanced fuel mix and the diversity of the assets in it, obviously compliance with regulations, and undertaking a reasonable level of risk, right? Not knowing what the risks and changes are going to be in the future, but to the best of one's ability, undertaking a reasonable level of risk. So those are kind of the criteria along which, or the dimensions along which one evaluates a proposal. And as I think most people here probably know, DTE made an industry-leading commitment last year. I was going to say this year, it's already 2018. Made an industry-leading commitment to an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050, with many interim commitments along the way. So under that plan, DTE basically already has a voluntary commitment to a level of renewables and energy efficiency and demand-side management and so forth that they're going to be pursuing. And then, of course, there's the state legislation around the level of renewables and energy efficiency. So coupled with all of that, the modeling of those 52 scenarios then suggests that, you know, the best option for now along all those dimensions, to balance all of those dimensions, is the gas-fired power plant that's being proposed. And one of those dimensions in particular that I think is worth, you know, a few extra words is reliability. And I know some of my fellow commissioners, you know, understand this piece well, but in order to manage reliability, the state and utilities actually break energy products into two pieces. They look at energy in two different ways. So they look at energy from what's called the energy product, which is like the kilowatt hours, the actual amount of electricity that's produced. And then the second piece is capacity. And capacity refers to the ability to produce that electricity as and when it's needed, on demand, 24/7, 365, under whatever conditions, to meet the potential projected loads. And you know, renewables have gotten very, very good at producing the energy, the electricity piece of it. They can produce a lot of kilowatt hours, right? I mean, we've gotten really good wind turbines, good solar production, but they still can't produce when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. And right now, we don't have large-scale, commercially viable, and kind of economically viable, affordable energy storage, which would be the other alternative to managing those fluctuations and that kind of lack of immediate capacity. We don't know when we'll get that. I think we will, but I don't know when. Nobody knows when. And so right now, in order to provide sufficient capacity to ensure reliability, none of us like having power outages. We all do. We all live in the Tree City, right? So we all know what it's like to experience a power outage. And if we don't have reliability 365 days a year under whatever weather conditions, you know, that DTE can't put forward a plan that cannot guarantee that. So my perspective and DTE's perspective in putting forward this proposal for the gas plant is that actually this gas plant is a really important enabler to the expansion of renewables over time, right? Already we've got you know, a good chunk of renewables. We all want more, but in order to do that, we need to ensure we've got baseload generation, which you can ramp up and ramp down, turn on and off when you need it, you know, whatever the weather is and as consumers demand it. So that this natural gas plant will enable that by ensuring that 24/7 reliability and kind of grid stability issues. So I know that everybody in this room, myself included, would love to snap our fingers and have, you know, all the renewables in the world tomorrow. I share that goal with everybody, but I do just want to be very clear that, you know, for DTE, this isn't a modeling exercise. For DTE, we have to walk away from whatever the outcome of the certificate of necessity is and provide that reliable and affordable energy in a year, in 5 years, in 25 years, right? It's not an intellectual exercise here. It's one that has to be delivered and executed upon. So that is why, you know, in conjunction with all the other commitments that the company has made around carbon reduction goals, the company believed that building this gas plant is kind of the next step, and one step of many of this long transformation of the generation portfolio, which, you know, began years ago and will continue for a couple decades here. But anyway, I want to share that perspective.
Thank you.
So I have a question to follow up on that. in the filings that they have made, did they demonstrate that this particular plant was necessary for that 24/7 dependability, or is that just the broad perspective of all of their plants?
Others have done modeling that show that it's not necessary for reliability.
And I would say here that this is a place where it's probably worth it to dive into the materials in the testimony, because DTE will describe in the testimony why, yes, this plant is required for reliability, and what the concerns with reliability are under other scenarios that others have submitted, where their own modeling might show that there's not a problem, but DTE would counter that. So
Differing opinions.
differing
Okay.
opinions
Thank
there,
you so
and that's
much.
why
Yeah.
the MPSC will do their own kind of pressure testing.
My guess is that this is a matter of modeling, and just like climate modeling, there are uncertainties, and it's also a question of risk and what's acceptable risk. And what might be an acceptable risk to some groups may be an unacceptable risk to other groups, like DTE or its customers. So that's what this is all about, and that's probably why there's different people coming to different conclusions, is because it is not absolutely precise.
So, two questions. First, thank you. I think that was a very thoughtful response and presentation, Shoshana. And one was, given that, why not wait and put this as part of the IRP process? Because, I hear what you're saying on that, but it seems like the IRP process is designed to get at some of those very questions. As I understand it, and I can't say I've read the thousands of pages of pieces, but this got out in front of that process. And then the second is just on the reliability issue. Remind us, what's the level of renewables that we're talking about? What percentage? Because as I understand it, we don't get into reliability issues until we get to 50% renewables, much higher levels. So that argument about baseload generation is one that I guess we haven't seen play out in other countries and states where the renewables levels are much higher. So I'm trying to figure out what percentage we're talking about and what's different in Michigan.
Yeah. So the first one on the timing relative to the IRP, so I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe that the MPSC put out the new IRP rules. I want to say it was back in November. It was relatively recently, and DTE had already kind of long started down the process, and the timing for it was driven by planning around coal retirements. And, here we're retiring some baseload generation and need to replace that, right? So that was kind of the decision around the timing. The reliability, so I would say it's basically what the utilities have to demonstrate is a capacity margin, meaning looking at, so that measure of how much capacity, how much energy you can turn on and say, I will have that available and commit to having that available to customers, has to be at some percentage above the peak of what's actually ever been experienced. And, it's roughly 10%. Those are actually set by the MISO, which is the Midwest organization that balances electricity needs across much of the Midwest. So as one is retiring generation that you can turn on with a flip of a switch, you need to replace it with that, or with a level of renewables that would be essentially, it would have to be that much higher, because renewables only get partial credit on that capacity, because the odds that you can get it
Sure.
exactly when you need it are lower, right? And it varies for wind and solar. But it's simply needing to exceed that maximum peak that you've experienced.
And as I understand it, correct if I'm wrong on this, the assumptions that were baked into DTE's analysis held renewables flat once the mandated levels were reached. Is that right? 'Cause what I've heard from some of the advocates on this is that if renewables continue to increase, you would get at those higher margins. But DTE was saying we're going to hold it flat once we reach the state mandated levels.
I don't want to misspeak on the details of the model, so I won't comment on that one. We can Google it, look it up in a minute if you want. But I would caution that adding additional renewables, it doesn't help for capacity. It doesn't help proportionally for capacity, right? So if you're adding those renewables for their energy, right, then the capacity that you're getting from them is less than the energy. So you actually need to overbuild relative to your energy needs in order to supply sufficient capacity.
That is in the process of changing somewhat, however, since there are areas of the country that they're now actually installing batteries along with, and I'm thinking of Texas, where they're putting in wind and solar farms with batteries. It's economical there. And there's a very large battery installation in Australia that they put in order to increase the reliability in one area there. So the battery technology, I think, in the very near future will become economical enough that it will eliminate a large portion of that. They're also developing, some of the limitations on cost now are has to do with the volume that they're making and the type of battery that they're using. And the one in Australia still uses the Panasonic Tesla battery that is fairly expensive to make and somewhat troublesome. But they're in the process, the laws on navigation are changing, and they're now going to, in a few years, require that all the ships that burn bunker fuel have to be able to get 20 kilometers out of port before they start burning it. And so that there's a company in Michigan that is in the process of, they've actually installed some in ships already, making very large, heavy battery systems that are very, very stable in order to meet that need. And that, along with other things, are going to crank up the volume that they make these things at and bring the cost down pretty substantially. We also have, at least in the past, they said that 9 to 10% of the energy that they produced was, shall we say, laundered through the pump station at Ludington. So by that I mean it was produced when it wasn't needed, and it was stored in raising water up to the top of the hill and then used later on. And they're actually, in their model, they were actually increasing the amount that they used that facility somewhat. So that there's already built in a certain amount of reliability using that kind of storage system. So I think that, and I know this is a very complex problem, and the modeling is very complex, and they used to say in the industry, I'll ask you what you want the results to be, and I'll produce it with modeling. So we all have to be a little bit careful of it. But considering that the organizations that have suggested that we need to send this back for remodeling have come from both ends of the spectrum. ABATE, basically, which is a very conservative group of large industries that actually want you to keep the coal plants open because they think they're cheaper, found problems with it, and the environmental end of things have also found problems with it. So I think that it might be prudent for them to retreat and to do a more complete IRP process and come back again. It's not to say that they shouldn't build something in the way of a plant necessarily. They may not need to, but they may not need to build as big a one even. So, and once you build it, you want to use it. And that puts greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere that we really can't afford to do it. So I'm certainly recommending I'm planning on voting for this resolution. Is there any more discussions or comments? Commissioner Schreiber.
Yeah, one super minor one, which is just the typo in the fifth whereas. It says should be its cap goals, but
Oh, thank you.
the, comment I have, and I apologize, I was not here at the last one, so maybe you discussed this, but is, and I strongly support this resolution. What are we asking to be done, right? So it says that the Energy Commission recommends that the MPSC, are we gonna be asking for city council to take up this resolution? And if so, should our resolution reflect that? I know we get to that question often here, but I'm not sure if this was discussed last time, or the resolution should read that, the Energy Commission recommends the city council, move from there, which is where I hope that we'll go with that. I think that lends a little more power to it.
We are certainly planning on sending it in that direction. Quite often, I think, if I remember right from previous resolutions, they simply substitute city council for Energy Commission.
I mean, the function is that. The wordsmithing's been slightly different over time. I think that approach would work. I mean, that's generally the role of the commission, to advise council.
Unless the attorney's office has some other thing that we should do. No, thank you.
So if I could,
Councilman Eaton.
Yes.
I think that you should adopt as a best practice having resolve clauses asking the council to do what you want them to do.
Okay.
And then when it gets to council, they can delete that particular paragraph. But a body acts through its resolutions, and if you want to ask us to act, you probably should do that in the future. In this particular case, the mayor and I have already indicated that we'll bring forward something a lot like this, so I don't think it's necessary to amend this particular one, but just as a practice, if you want council to do something, you should ask us.
That is true. It is clearer that way, isn't it? Okay, thank you for the advice. We will take that into consideration. Any other?
Were you done, Mike?
Yes, Sam.
I'd like to address what at least I consider to be the elephant in the room, and if I'm incorrect, I'd like somebody to correct me. But what none of this discussion thus far, at least formally, addresses are the externalities associated with burning fossil fuels. And my understanding is the reason for that is that by state law, the MPSC cannot take that into account. So what that means is that all of the analysis that is submitted on both sides can't address that factor. And what that means is there's an implied assumption that there are no costs to human health, there are no costs to ecosystems, there are no costs associated with weather events. And I just looked up, according to the largest, or one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world, they insure insurers. The costs associated with the losses associated with weather-related events are up 5 times since 1980. So those kinds of costs, they're approaching something like $300 billion a year. So those kinds of costs are not reflected in the analysis. And I think really many of us here as commissioners and many of the people in the room are concerned about the externalities of burning fossil fuel. And indeed, if there was to be a broader recognition in Michigan, as there have been in certainly other countries and in other states, 18 states have higher RPS standards than the state of Michigan. 18 other states obviously recognize that there are externalities. And if, for example, something that this group has recommended doing in a resolution that we unanimously approved, which was that there should be a carbon fee and dividend applied to all carbon-based fuels, that would impose an additional cost on burning natural gas, and that would then have an impact on the financials that the MPSC would have to take into consideration. Also, if the petition is successful, to put a ballot initiative on the ballot in November to raise the RPS from 15 to 30%. That would also potentially have some kind of impact on the modeling for this. So for those reasons, and in particular because of the externalities, which really formally can't be reflected here and reflected in the MPSC's work, I will support this resolution because I'm concerned about those externalities and the state of the planet that we're leaving for my children and all of our children and their children.
You bring up an interesting point. The externalities, for the people at home, they might want to look up the Solutions Project, where they've done studies for every state in the union and also for the world, looking at becoming 100% renewables, and they maintain that the externalities are such that you could go to 100% renewables by 2030, I believe, and the reduced cost of the externalities would basically pay for that movement in 17 years. Decreased deaths, decreased health issues, and such. So it's sort of an interesting thing to look out. It's sort of modeling really taken out even farther, so of course
Higher uncertainties.
it's probably a little bit,
I'll
I
just
wouldn't
add
look at
one
the
thing on
details.
the externalities, because it's an issue I'm passionate about, and I think absolutely critical as our economy that we handle this issue. One thing that I grapple with personally, and I supported that economy-wide carbon tax and dividend issue, but I do not know a solution if one addresses this industry by industry, because it raises a lot of potential even worse externalities. So an example in the kind of electric space is if you embed the cost of externalities, as many would like to do, within the electric space, it could become a heck of a lot more economic to run gasoline generators than to buy electricity from the grid, right? If you really truly embedded some of those costs, I don't know. But that would be, that's sort of like the hypothetical risk, right? And we'd all be shooting ourselves in the foot from an environmental perspective if, everybody who was going after the economics of it switched to gasoline-fired generators in their, backyards and in their businesses. So I think when you address it in one industry or another, there's a lot of potential unintended consequences, which is makes it a solution that I think has to be addressed at the economy-wide level.
That certainly wasn't my intention, and I don't think it was
Yeah.
ours as we adopted that resolution in favor of an economy-wide
Exactly, yes,
carbon fee and dividend proposal.
Yep.
Yep.
yeah.
Input or questions, comments from commissioners? If not, I'll call for a vote. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
For the record, one opposed and the rest supporting. Thank you, one and all. Moving on to a much more inspiring thing here, Energy Commission bylaws update. Mr. Frost.
This is a room clearer. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about the process for amending bylaws, because most of you have probably not done it before. Council requires that the Attorney's Office prepare standard bylaws for the various boards and commissions, which we then adapt to your specific requirements, present those at a meeting, and then at a subsequent meeting, they can be adopted, amendments can be considered, and then once the commission has adopted those bylaws, they go to council for final approval to take effect. I believe I've provided, everyone's been provided with the draft copy of this. I know I already got some questions on it. I'm happy to try to answer some general questions about process or the bylaws, but if you have specific questions, please contact me directly, or you can go through Nate. And then I will provide answers to the group so that you can all have that when you deliberate next time on these. We found that that's the best way to do it. And so most of this should be fairly self-explanatory, at least it's designed to be that way. A couple of areas that people get concerned about. First of all, the purpose, objectives, and duties section, that's based on council's enabling acts, whether it's an ordinance or a resolution. In this case, it's a resolution that created the body. That describes what council has prescribed your role to be. And I know that you as a commission do lots of other things, and those other roles that you do, usually the bylaws are not the best place for them. That's something that's better put into like a work plan or annual report or something like that. So just, that question comes up a lot, so I wanted to touch on that. The other major issues that people have are with the ethics and conflicts of interest section. It's a fairly detailed section. That's because conflicts of interest are very case-by-case and fact-specific. So this is really to give you a sort of some kind of a framework to hang your hats on when you're considering these issues. We're always available to advise on specific questions on that. It's not designed to prevent anyone from voting except in fairly specific instances of conflicts. And if you'll read the first section, it talks about making these on a case-by-case basis, these decisions, and with a reasonable application of the principles. So it's aimed at disclosures, at understanding what everyone's potential conflicts might be. Other than that, most of the rest of it is fairly self-explanatory. Most of these provisions are standard, but if you have areas that you feel you need different provisions, we're happy to work with you on that. So that's all I've got. If anyone's got any general questions, I'm happy to answer.
How much of this is new? Has anything changed since we looked at it last year?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know, what did you look at last year?
I'm not sure what that reference is to either, but yeah, this sort of is a whole new set of things, and there's a lot more content here. So I think the hope is that in April, you have a chance to take this, digest it, and we'll spend some time at that work session, especially contrasting or comparing to the existing bylaws. This is sort of just the new set laid out here.
Okay.
Yeah, the existing bylaws are, I think, very old, from probably when the commission was created. So this is going to be the standard template that's been developed since then. So it's going to look probably quite different.
I have just a general question. Are there typically different bylaws for the commissions that are purely advisory versus those that are with decision-making authority? Because I know both those kinds of commissions exist, and it feels to me like you might have quite a different kind of set of bylaws.
They're mostly the same.
They are?
It's mostly to do with the duties and roles of those bodies, and most of those bodies have some other enabling legislation, statutory or otherwise, that have more specific requirements. So,
Okay.
but in general, they're mostly the same. And these are, continually updated, these standard ones. So the standard bylaws that were adopted, 3 years ago by another body, it might look a little different than these, but essentially they're all supposed to be uniform to the extent practical.
Just to clarify, are we adopting them, or is it city council that adopts
So,
them?
you adopt them in your own
Okay.
process, and then they go to city council for final approval.
Okay.
Yep, and that's a council resolution requires that.
Is there a reason that the membership of a city council person on this commission has been eliminated?
That is not a requirement of the body. That's just a council elective appointment. They can choose to do that or not.
It was a requirement in the other bylaws.
Right. Those bylaws were not reflective of the resolution that council passed. So only council can dictate who's going to be on the commission. I believe council has always had someone on this body, and that's up to them. If you would like to make that proposal that they change that, you can always do that as well.
Okay. I'd hate to lose that. It's hard enough. There's always been supposedly two, but only one has been appointed in recent history.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just on the officers part of it, is it always said no member shall serve more than 3 consecutive full terms in the same office?
Yeah, that
I
is.
think
that-
Wayne's violated by 20 years or so. But, you know, I'm not trying to kick Wayne out, but I'm just saying, we might be about 20 years past that.
Yeah, that's just the standard provision
Okay.
that we recommend.
I move that we continue to ignore it, but.
So as I say, if you have more specific questions, feel free to submit them to me or Nate.
This isn't China.
And if you have, questions that you need to talk to me specifically about, I'm happy to do that, on the phone or in person or whatever you need.
So is my understanding correct that this is just introducing the topic? We will discuss it in the working session, which is probably better suited for the catch-ball associated with this, and then we'll take formal action in a subsequent meeting, whether that's the following month or shortly thereafter.
Yep, I think that's on point.
Good. I think that makes sense.
So can you give us any guidance about leeway?
Like I say, if you got questions, ask them, and I'm happy to advise you on that.
I do have one question, since you're here and most of us are here. What is the rationale for someone who has a conflict of interest from not being able to participate in the conversation, so to speak, in the discussion? And I think that's in one of the clauses, 5 something or other.
4.
I mean, it seems to me that we can easily identify that there is a conflict of interest. That commissioner can then be excused from taking a vote or making a vote. But it seems to me, or I'll speak for myself, I would like to hear contrary opinions all the time. And just because, in the case of tonight, we, have different opinions here as commissioners, and I think it's important that we hear both sides. And not only that, I think it's important that residents, either that are here or that are watching, also get to hear a different opinion. Or, I'm saying it's different, but they may agree with everyone else, but it's potentially a different opinion. And is there a reason for not including in the bylaws a statement that says they cannot participate in the discussion?
And that's kind of a standard best practice for
It is.
conflict recusals. Most bodies that have conflict recusals would have that provision, and I believe it would be just to prevent them from unduly influencing the discussion when they have a conflict. But again, depending on what the conflict is, you may not even need to go that far. It may be enough to simply disclose it and then continue with the discussion and vote. So, but again, if you have a specific question about a specific conflict, we can certainly talk about it.
So that would be a possible change that we could make in the language, to disclose it, to continue the discussion, and then during voting, exclude that person from the voting process. That would be an option available to us.
Yeah, and under the current language, you don't even need to make that change. It's already in there that the conflict is more for disclosure and then to determine whether or not the person should be recused or
Okay,
not.
maybe I didn't read it closely enough. Thanks.
Yeah, and we can take this up when we meet, but I would say this might get back to what Commissioner Alinsky was talking about before. If you were a decision-making body, I could see that making a heck of a lot more sense than the advisory body that we are. So that's where I could see you might not want to unduly influence the discussion. Even planning commission or something like that would be, I think, a different set of things than what we're looking at here, which is advisory overall. And I agree, we want all possible opinions anyway.
Yeah, and the extreme example would be if the body is voting to recommend that city council enter into a contract with a company that a commissioner owns and runs. That's kind of the extreme case where you may want to consider recusal. Most do not come to that level.
If they recuse themselves, we can still call them for comment as a representative of that company or something. Like we could still have them in the conversation.
Yeah, I don't know that would be appropriate under the guidance, but another representative of the company could speak.
Other questions? Okay. Thank you for introducing this. We'll get into the weeds on it in our next meeting and then vote on it the following meeting. Committee updates. Environmental Commission, Commissioner Mirsky.
So just broadly speaking, The Environmental Commission has really been focused on solid waste issues, and why I think solid waste is of interest also to this commission is that there have been estimates made that if Ann Arbor were to reduce, increase its solid waste diversion by 50%, that would be the equivalent of taking roughly 1,600 vehicles off the road. So it has greenhouse gas and therefore climate action plan implications. So the last meeting that we had was actually a working session. So you can't go online and see the meeting or anything like that. But we spent basically the entire meeting addressing questions about solid waste, and in particular, the solid waste fund financials and the reserve. So there's a restricted reserve, which is linked to the landfill, and closing the landfill and making sure that there's funds available to close that properly in an environmentally sound way, in a safe way. And then there's unrestricted funds that allows the city to basically go through ups and downs in costs and revenues associated, for example, with commodity prices and things like that. And the commission submitted a number of questions about both funds. Those were addressed verbally. We were told that we would get written responses, and those would be then available to the public at large. I'd just like to call everyone's attention to the following concerns that are sort of the basic concerns of the Environmental Commission. First of all, Councilman Eaton, I think this is really important that as councilperson, you're cognizant of this, and you were there, but so he attended the working session. A big concern is, of course, that the materials recycling facility that Ann Arbor, the MRF that Ann Arbor owns, is not been functioning since June of 2016. Prior to that date, Ann Arbor was spending about, let me give the figure exactly, because I have it here, about $3.6 million a year for material recovery. After the MRF was closed down because of safety and equipment issues, material recovery costs increased to $6.6 million. These are the city's own figures. So that's a $3 million increase. And by the way, that $3.6 million is roughly the figure from fiscal year 10 through fiscal year 16. So it was not just something that was 1 or 2 years. During that whole time frame, costs ranged from $3.3 million to $3.8 million, and they went up to 6.6. The city is forecasting that without any significant changes, those costs will continue at the rate of $5.9 million a year. So we're talking about well over $2 million a year more than what it had been prior to that. So some of our questions were directed at that, and of course what the impact of that will be on the reserve. There's also some additional questions that have come up recently about also assumptions related to what is called recycling processing credit, which we understand is basically the revenue that the city gets from selling recycled materials such as cardboard, such as aluminum and things like that, because the city's numbers indicate that that revenue was basically zero in 2015 and 2016, and will be 1 million in 17, or all was 1.1 million in fiscal year 17, and will be 1 million in 18 and 19. And as anybody that's been following recycling issues, they know that China is now greatly restricting or basically cutting off materials going to China. Commodity prices have fallen dramatically. So there's just a lot of questions about some of the basic financials behind this. There's also questions on the city's stated diversion rate. So if you go to the sustainability dashboard, which is the city's official way of communicating diversion rates. It's shown as roughly 46%. There's some indication that it's actually closer to 32%, and there's also potentially some waste streams that are not included. So there's a whole bundle of issues which have been raised with the city that were discussed verbally in the working session, and where we're looking for results, or I should say written answers, prior to our next meeting, not this Thursday, but the following Thursday. And just one other topic related to solid waste. The city put out a request for proposal for support in drawing up its new solid waste resource management plan. The old plan expired at the end of last year, and there's a process planned for coming up with a new plan that should complete it in the second quarter of next year. 4 proposals were received. I was the environmental commissioner's representative to sit through that process, probably because I'm retired and I have the time to do it, but for no other reason. In any case, I sat through those. There are what I would say 4 at least good proposals and several very good proposals. So I am confident that we will get at least a good proposal and a good partner in working on that plan. So that will be hopefully taken up, and the city will announce its final recommendation, and that will go to the Environmental Commission in its meeting at the end of this month, and then from there it would go to City Council for a final decision.
Okay. Thank you for that update. Climate Action Plan Priorities and Target Centering. Neither of the heads of that are here tonight. Do you know of any update on that?
I just believe some draft content has been shared and assembled by Commissioner Hookham, and feedback sort of being gathered remotely at this point.
Great. Solar schools.
The Pioneer High School and the STEAM School are still working on their application for the contest, the My Solar School contest. The other thing, and Commissioner Mirsky, did you want to mention the houses of worship with the community solar expansion? Do you want to talk about that?
Well, so I think at least commissioners here know that there is a community solar subcommittee that is looking at a variety of community solar options, one of which was solar on schools, another is solar on houses of worship, or the so-called Solar Faithful initiative that's being run out of the Energy Office. And then we're looking at other options. DTE has in effect something like a community solar option. There are other commercial options out there from Arcadia Power. And so the idea was to look at all of those, gather information, and publish that in a form where residents could look at all the various options, and depending on what's important to them, whether it's cost, whether it's whatever it might be, supporting their school, they could look at that and then have that enable them to make hopefully an informed decision. So we have not met since December, because partly there hadn't been a whole lot of progress in the individual subgroups, but my sense is that maybe it does make sense that we meet again soon, considering what's going on with Pioneer and the STEAM School. And then also there's been a couple of Solar Faithful open houses, or what did you call them? One back last Sunday. I know Josh was there. So I think if that's your question, I think it's appropriate that we reconvene probably that group just to give an update, and then also give a formal update to the commission as a whole on where things stand.
Yeah, and also to work to kind of create kind of a coalition, a sector, including the county, the city, houses of worship.
Yes.
Public schools, maybe hospitals.
Some of the financial models have shown that they're most likely can be adopted by multiple applications of community solar. So yes, that makes sense.
That's it.
Great, thank you.
When again is that award to be announced?
At the Earth Day Festival
Uh-huh.
in, I think it's the 22nd of April, I believe.
Great. Ordinances,
I don't have any updates.
okay. Public input. We still have public here. Is there anyone who'd like to say anything? Come to the front and state your name and limit your speaking to 3 minutes.
Quick comment to John about the solid waste. I don't know if any of the proposals had included essentially charging by the pound for landfill. You know, lots of other countries and places around the world do that to help their diversion rates.
That will certainly be one of the things that's considered in the plan that the city develops. There's, from what I understand, lots of positives associated with that. There are some negatives, and that is that sometimes people will put garbage in their recycling in order to avoid the cost of what that is associated with putting garbage in a garbage container. So they try to avoid any financial impacts by essentially mixing garbage with recyclables or compostables, which is obviously a problem. So that will be something that will be considered, and the plan will make recommendations. What then finally is done will be up to, I'm sure, commissions and the city.
Hello, my name is Chris Karinas. I'm a National Science Foundation Research Fellow at the University of Michigan. I study carbon sequestration using natural systems. I've also read the detailed analysis of DTE's proposal and why it's flawed. I agree strongly with the flaws that were found in it. Many things, including using old solar systems that don't maximize capacity, fixed tilt solar systems instead of single axis tracking systems, and more modern wind turbines that reach up into the upper atmosphere where there's a more consistent energy source. I think are really important points that aren't included in the DTE proposal, and I wanted to thank you guys so much for passing the resolution today. I think that is a huge stride, and I want to also encourage you guys to reach out to the MPSC personally and have conversations with them, because you guys have the public standing and the position where you can actually talk with a commissioner. I don't have that ability to have a conversation with one of the commissioners. I've tried, trust me. And so I also want to bring to attention the potential conflict of interest that DTE has, and remind the council that DTE is looking in for the best interests of their company. They're a publicly traded company. They need to maximize profits. They're legally required to. They're not looking out for the best interest of people or even the cheapest option. They're looking for the option that maximizes their margin. And assets that they own, expensive assets like a natural gas power plant, does that. It maximizes their profits. Whereas doing purchasing plans of renewable energy might not. They also co-own the Nexus pipeline, which is a natural gas pipeline, and it's currently underutilized. So they're losing money on that, and it's an unregulated affiliate company. So they're not allowed to bias their decision towards that. But obviously it's going to play into the financials behind the scenes. So they're not public champions, but you guys are. You guys are the public champions, and thank you for being that. And also the MPSC is the public champion. So we need to hold them accountable for doing what's best to the public interest, which is providing the cheapest energy. And I mean, a lot of people that are DTE ratepayers are choosing between paying for their energy bill, paying for medicine, or paying for food. And this is a serious amount of money. I mean, 7 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the suggested rate hike. I would have to pay over $900 a year more for electricity. So by using renewables, I could save $300 a year. So this is a really important issue to me. I think it's important to a lot of people that are tight on money. And obviously, all the environmental things aside, I mean, it's just a clear decision that we need to look deeper into this conflict of interest and have a proposal that has more serious about assessing modern day renewables and have justified reasons for these numbers that are less favorable to renewables. Because currently, there's not been a lot of answers about why these numbers are so low. Also want to thank you guys for your work with the Climate Action Plan. That's a really important thing to me, and I hope you guys can continue to work on that and really spend a lot of energy and time on that. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Any other input from the audience? If not, we'll move on to items for the next agenda, which is a working session. Any?
If not, we'll be talking a lot of bylaws, so.
Yeah, so bring coffee.
Or we'll have a short meeting.
Lots of coffee. Okay. Hearing nothing else on that, I'll declare this meeting adjourned at 7:30.